We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I'm the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm very excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Jess Yuen. She is the advisor and coach to executives at high growth organizations. Jess, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns and when you were younger, how did you answer the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Well, thank you, Christina, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And a little bit about me, I'm married and a mama to two kiddos who are 4.5 and 2.5. And the half is very important to them, so I make sure to mention that. And they keep me on my toes. And when I think about sharing my background, I usually think about it in 3 acts. And nowadays I have the great honor to be a board advisor and executive coach to VC-backed companies who care about people and culture. And prior to that, I spent a better part of a decade in startups, in high growth startups as an executive myself, going through kind of all of the ups and downs that come with exciting growth. And my early career, I actually got started kind of in a different part of the spectrum from the world of people in HR. I studied electrical engineering. I went to management consulting at McKinsey and focused on operational and organizational transformation. And then I was a product manager in big tech for a short period before getting into the startup world. And when I was young, I love this question because it really made me think. I had to kind of go back into the archives of my terrible memory of like, what did I want to be? And there were three careers that I realized that I wanted to have. The first was I wanted to be a cancer researcher. My grandfather passed away when I was 5 from cancer. And I just thought, you know what, I'm going to cure cancer so that by the time my parents are, facing this, it'll be, we'll have a cure. So very optimistic. And then the second career was everybody in my class wanted to be a dolphin trainer when I was growing up because I grew up in California and they would go to like SeaWorld and decide, dolphin trainer was the thing to be. And I could not, I'm a terrible swimmer. And so I was like, that seems like a bad job for somebody who's not good at swimming. So I decided I was going to become a marine biologist because I thought, maybe this cancer thing I can't solve, but I could become a marine biologist and it's still in the science vein. And then the third was my dream job, and I still aspire to this day. Is I wanted to be an ice cream taste tester. I just thought this would be right, like the dream, amazing. So I live this out very regularly at home, where I practice and test out my ice cream taste testing skills.
Wow, that's 3 very different answers, and I love the inspiration behind all of them as well. I think that is incredible. And you shared a little bit about your personal journey and kind of, your experience. And I have a ton of questions, but I want to ask first, what really defines you?
Yeah. Oh, what a question. Because I think it's sometimes can feel hard to synthesize oneself in just a few statements. But I would say I'm probably defined by a few things. I'm defined by what I value, and I highly value learning and impact. And it's something throughout my whole career where I've tried to stay curious and follow opportunities that have a positive impact on the world. And given that, it's no wonder I ended up in the people space. But I'm also defined by my family and upbringing. I'm American-born Chinese woman, born to immigrants who came with very little, and were fortunate to end up being able to make a wonderful life here. And I feel very, very fortunate for the life I get to live in light of how far my family's come. And the family I have today of, being a wife to an incredible partner who cooks and cleans and works hard and makes me laugh and is just such a wonderful parent. So I feel very fortunate to have that in my life, and a mother to 2 incredible toddlers who never cease to amaze me with their capacity to learn and to love. And I'm defined by my personality. I think I'm defined by my impatience for change. The impatience sometimes is problematic, also dealing with toddlers on a regular basis. So I'm learning how to turn that impatience into patience. I'm defined by my personality where I really like helping others, and I love corny jokes and fast food and must read books. So there's a whole, there's always different aspects and facets to oneself, and I could keep going, but it's much more fun to talk about other things than talk about myself.
No, I love that. I think that is what you said earlier around, boiling it down to a couple of sentences is really hard, but I'm always curious to see what is top of mind for folks as well. In terms of kind of your passion for helping people, I know one of the things that we discussed in terms of this conversation was your passion for kind of onboarding. And I want to ask, from your experience and perspective, when really does the quote unquote onboarding process start for new team members?
Yeah, and I do have such a passion for onboarding. I recently shared a Udemy course called The Ultimate Guide to Employee Onboarding. And this is one of the biggest misconceptions of what is onboarding. And oftentimes we think it is this quick day one, a few hour experience where people are going to like come in, get all of their stuff set up, and boom, they're ready to be successful in a new company. And really, onboarding is a much longer experience that starts the moment a candidate says, yes, I'm going to join this organization, is an opportunity to start building the relationship and start thinking about how do we set up somebody for success. And so even giving them through what I will call orientation, which is kind of that first day one or even few day initial week one introduction to the company, it's actually can be a multi-month onboarding process for most employees, because there's so much to sort of acclimate to and understand, and context to get, and expectations to set and realign on over that period of time, so that someone can be really fully functioning and ready for that new role.
Yeah, absolutely. It is not just a quick, even like day or 2 week process. It is a month-long process. And it's important to involve a lot of different stakeholders as well to the organization. In a kind of remote first or virtual world, a lot of organizations, and rightfully so, have redesigned their onboarding programs. Can you tell us about a new hire journey that is really impactful, and how you think about kind of measuring that impact?
Yeah, definitely. So I think about the new hire journey in kind of 4 segments, because I think it can be long and complex. And sometimes when talking about, oh, we need to revamp our onboarding program, or we need to design a new one, it can feel like, oh my gosh, how do I sort of tackle this big thing? So anytime I have a big problem I'm trying to deal with, I think about, how do I break it down into smaller segments? Because it's just a lot easier to tackle in that way. So the 4 parts of the new hire onboarding process I think about are pre-onboarding, which goes from offer sign to day one. And then I think about day one or week one as kind of its own thing, because it's usually what most companies already have some kind of foundation or foothold in. Then I think about the rest of month one. And then then usually for most companies is, a 2 or 3 month journey beyond that they're thinking about as well. And for each of those parts of the journey, I'll think about 3 dimensions. Or 4 dimensions, 4 dimensions. One is the emotional dimension of what are we trying to convey or instill in the new hire. There's a component around logistics, paperwork, make sure they get paid on time, that they have their laptop set up. There's a context element and an engagement element. And in a remote environment, it just needs to be much more intentional about how you create that environment and that confidence. And so there's pieces of the logistics and context setting that you can do through, a wiki page, videos that you're sharing, a swag box that arrives at the right time, the laptop, all of those are kind of pieces of it. But the element of, we care about you, we see you, sometimes it needs to be much more intentional, where like maybe every team member is slacking that person on their first day. The manager's going out of their way to make sure that the one-on-one's absolutely happening, and it feels like, that the individual has a chance to share, because you're not being able to read all of their body language because you're only seeing the neck up. So there's a lot of nuances to the remote onboarding process that are much more about, how do you just make sure that it feels cohesive and inclusive throughout.
Absolutely. And that intentionality piece is so important. And I think the logistics, context, and engagement all influence your emotions of the new hire and the person who's joining the team as well. And it's really
Yeah.
important, especially in a remote world when you're not saying hello in the kitchen, in the, in the conference room, and you're not seeing your team members in person day to day. I want to kind of ask in terms of re-onboarding, maybe that's not the right word for it, but that's what I thought of in terms of your perspective on re-onboarding or retraining folks who have been in an organization for 2, maybe 5 years with new hires. And what I mean by that is ensuring that everybody is on the same page with kind of that context and engagement, knowing that emotions change when you have worked at a company for a long period of time. Maybe like the team has changed as well.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I'm a huge proponent of re-onboarding. I just think there's so many times in someone's career where you're kind of reevaluating, is this the right place for me? Are all the things that I were hoping for from this role or for this company actually living out? And so there are particular points in time, as you're mentioning, like when someone's coming back from a leave, whether a parental leave or a leave of absence. If you get a promotion or you're changing roles, internal transfers, where there's an opportunity to sort of reestablish context and reestablish expectations. And with onboarding, there's wonderful stats all around how it improves productivity, it lengthens employee tenure, it increases employee satisfaction in the role. And so there's a lot of benefits to onboarding itself. And so those all kind of relay over into re-onboarding as well. And I think the other thing that maybe is helpful to mention, both respect to remote onboarding as well as re-onboarding, is that our idea of what traditional onboarding is this orientation. You go in and you sit in a room and listen to somebody talk at you. But because of this new way of engaging with people, there's also this element of some of it is happening synchronously and some of it is asynchronously as well. And there's this opportunity with re-onboarding that it doesn't mean we have to take all these employees and put them in a room for a couple of days or, like take them off the job. I think there's an opportunity to think about how do you introduce it maybe in more bite-sized ways or a more, over a period of time to be able to get people into that. One other thing I'll say about re-onboarding relates to just the way I think about culture in general is I define it as the words, actions, and behaviors of a group of people. And when you think about that definition, in a company, the group of people is almost always changing. Someone's either coming or going or both. And so the words, actions, and behaviors of the group are inherently going to be shifting a bit or moving around. And so when we're thinking about creating culture, there's an opportunity with onboarding to sort of, nudge, shape, influence what the words, actions, and behaviors that we're using. And so with re-onboarding, it's an opportunity to kind of reestablish, hey, maybe when you joined a couple of years ago, here was commonly the words, actions, behaviors that you were seeing or that we were thinking about. And here's how we've changed because the company's changed and here's kind of the new version of it. I often used to kind of joke that the hardest employees to train are actually the earliest ones because especially in a growing startup, they were there before a lot of maybe the processes were there, maybe even traditions were set, right? And so they kind of are like, I don't need to follow this because I knew that it was okay to do, not do this thing before it existed. So it should be fine if I continue doing this. So it's also an opportunity to kind of bring everybody in the organization up to speed and kind of to this new, way of working together and interacting with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's important that it is intentional and you're kind of a reframe of these opportunities to re-engage folks to make sure everybody is on the same page. And company culture is definitely something that is active, it's dynamic, not static, and it's changing all the time as new people are joining the team as well. I know some of the best onboarding kind of experiences that I've had really included everyone, not everyone, I should say, most people in the kind of organization, or at least someone from each department. And I felt like it was really a warm welcome. I want to ask from your perspective, especially working with leaders and executives, what is the kind of unique role that executives do play in co-creating an equitable workplace?
Yes, I love that. And I love that you've had experiences where you've seen executives coming in, even or different departments coming in, even from the beginning to sort of share, here's what we're doing, here's what we're about, and setting that context and sort of role modeling, here's how we want this interaction to go. And I think that's really where executives have a role in creating an equitable workplace is that role modeling element. What I think is amazing is when working with different companies, how much the culture that you experience is a reflection of the leaders in the organization. And sometimes it's not even a very conscientious one, but I've seen if you have a very extroverted leader, you'll oftentimes have a very boisterous, discussion culture. If you have a leader who is really great at organization, it's a very organized culture. And it's just amazing that mirroring that happens. And so I think cultures are often an accentuation of a leader's greatest strengths, as well as their challenges or weaknesses. And so I think executives have a really unique role because they're shaping the environment, and what they pay attention to and value is really what's going to make a difference. So, for example, in creating an equitable workplace, if you're in a meeting and you have maybe only a couple of people out of the whole group who are commenting or actually having the discussion, for a leader to pause and actually invite others in and say, hey, we haven't heard from a few others in the room. I imagine some of you might be thinking, have some thoughts. Would anybody else like to share? And sort of opening up the space for others to voice what they're thinking. That's incredible, because what's the signal in that moment? The signal is around, we care about what you think. I'm going to pause the rest of the conversation for us to reflect on those things. I really want to hear from you. And so by role modeling, it also shows like, hey, here's how you can do it. Like when we're not seeing the behaviors happening naturally, here's a nice way to interject. And suddenly you've taught an entire room of people how we're going to be able to do this in other meetings outside of this particular one.
I think role modeling is so important, and people take cues from who's leading the kind of meeting, who is engaging, actively listening, and demonstrating that I hear you, I see you, or I want to hear you and see you, and opening up that opportunity in meetings is a really good example. I think that a lot of people, look at their manager or they look at executives and they wonder kind of what the career path is. We know that the journey is not linear, but I definitely want to ask, what skills or experiences, if any particular ones, are necessary for folks to move from that individual contributor level to management level, and then decide, I want to be an executive. What does that mean? And what skills are necessary there?
Yeah, absolutely. I was realizing as you were talking, I didn't answer one question you had asked around how to measure
Oh, yeah.
equitable workplace.
Okay.
And I just want to come back to it just because I think all too often we're not thinking enough about analytics and how to measure these things. And it's really, really important. I think thinking about metrics like equal promotion rates of men versus women, or equal airtime of participants in meeting, but just having that view of what we care about, we can actually pretty easily measure a lot of these things nowadays. And the role of the executive is actually to be asking for these metrics and regularly looking at them. And by taking these different lenses of demographics, whether it's gender, ethnicity, or something else, I think there's an opportunity to just make sure that we're doing it in an equitable way. So I just wanted to add that one point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think that's important too. And just giving examples of metrics, what is measured is really important there as well. So I think those examples are great too.
Yeah, I love the phrase measure what matters.
Yeah.
And so if we're not measuring it, then it's not being seen as mattering to us or being important to us. Going back to your question around, thinking about what does it take to become an executive and what's the career path? I think these days we're seeing more and more unique paths to get into the leadership teams and the C-suites. And so for me, I really focus when I'm coaching with executives to think about kind of three pillars or three legs of a stool. And one is kind of the IC skills of, I can own my work, be responsible for it, execute. I'm a growth mindset person who loves learning, can be curious. There's a second pillar around management, which is that I can hire, develop, and retain a team. I can lead them from a vision or a strategy into execution. And I'm doing it for kind of a scoped piece of the organization. What really makes an executive different is that they're thinking about this third pillar in addition to the other two, which is that they're thinking about the company holistically, right? I might be the people leader and thinking about, things on the HR team like onboarding and performance management and all of that great stuff. But I'm also an executive of the organization, which means I need to be understanding the business metrics. I need to be thinking about, is our go-to-market strategy effective? I need to be understanding, is our product roadmap going to get us to where we need to be? I need to be thinking more broadly about how all these components come together, and is our company going to be successful? There's also this element within those, that thinking from a company level of that broader focus also means I need to be more strategic. Mm-hmm. So I find that most of the time for ICs and managers, you're thinking on, months or quarter time frame, and with executives, you're thinking more on a multi-year time frame. And so you're trying to be able to see around corners, understanding the broader landscape of not just our company, but how do we situate in the broader industry as well. And we can't predict everything, as we've learned time and again in the last couple of years, especially globally, but it's as much as possible trying to understand, okay, given all the confluence of factors, how do we approach those as a leadership team? And then there's two other things that I'll mention for executives that I think are really helpful and important that are different. I think one is on the communication element. As I talked to a leader a couple of years ago, and he described his job as being a dot connector. So he thinks he thinks about it and frames it as all of the conversations that he has, whether with his team, other peer teams, or with the leadership team, are pieces of data. And as a leader in the organization, it's his job to actually say, this dot and that dot actually need to go together, and I can bring it together, or I can help bridge the gaps, because there's a unique vantage point there. And I really loved that visual of being the dot connector. And I think it's a skill that ICs and managers can practice regularly as well, because they're also seeing from a vantage point that no one else can see too, right? There are very few people who are going to talk to those particular customers or have those particular interactions. But in an executive role, you're a dot connector across usually a much broader scope. And so I think the ability to communicate that and think about how are we communicating that and to which audiences is really, really critical. And then the last one is making decisions, I think, as an executive. And again, this is a skill you can practice as an IC and a manager, of being able to make decisions, figure out who are the right stakeholders to bring in, the right resources to tap into. But what's different is, as an IC or a manager, oftentimes if you kind of come into a roadblock or you're not sure what to do, you escalate it and you say, hey, like, here's how far I got. Like, yeah. Here I go, like, help me figure it out, person above me. And when you're an executive, if you go to the CEO with that, more times than not, there are CEOs who will say, yes, I'll step in. But more times than not, the CEO is like, okay, what do you need? How are you going to solve that? Right. And they look right back at you. And so the escalation point is yourself. And so it's figuring out, how do I then, even if I don't know the answer, get the right resources and tap into the right things to be able to move forward on some of these trickier problems.
I love that. I like the analogy of the kind of dot connector, looking at things from a big picture, bringing resources together, and really collaboration as well. I think those are helpful kind of touch points to think about. You could practice as an individual contributor and as a manager. You don't have to wait to do these things too. In terms of thinking about yourself as an executive or a leader in every sense of the word, how should we be thinking about measuring accountability to lead an organization that's both internally for the individual and externally KPIs for an organization, if they are kind of doing a great job as someone who is a shepherd of the culture and leading the organization as well?
Yeah, so I love that we're coming back to, how do we measure this, right? Like, so are we doing it? Is it happening? Because that's really important for us to understand and have a pulse on what's going on and what's going well and not. And so, coming back to those three pillars, those three legs of the stool, I think it's important to think about, what's happening successfully as an individual, as a team, and as a company. And as a company, there's usually OKRs or company goals or company level metrics that we can pretty clearly be able to define or measure. And even something at a super high level, like our employee NPS, right, might be an indicator at a company level. Are we doing things in an equitable way? Or maybe there's a specific question on our engagement survey that's speaking to those things. And pairing that with like, is our business doing well? And do we have a positive culture around it? At the team level, I'm a big fan of, again, using engagement surveys or understanding what's happening at that level. And I think, Google's Project Oxygen years ago made some really wonderful progress in proving out the effectiveness of just asking questions like, does your manager have regular one-on-ones with you? Right. Do you feel like your manager actually cares about you? And some of these basic components that allow you to say, okay, yes, our team is functioning, and be able to see that. I think as a people leader, Culture Amp and some of these other incredible tools have been able to show like a very clear heat map even, and saying like, hey, here's parts of the organization that are doing well at this and not, and being able to standardize questions that can be asked around it. And then I think the third is that individual success. And this is where I feel like it varies a lot for executives in particular, because as an organization, there's usually a performance review process, maybe a 360 process that's getting run for most everyone. And at the executive level, some companies are really good about running this process also for their executives, which is incredible and should be done. But there are a number where, there's just not time for it. And the CEO is, maybe not the most management oriented, team management oriented person. Mm-hmm. And that's the place where I think there is opportunity when we think about executive accountability and how they're leading the organization and the effectiveness of it, that there's an opportunity in what we do for the individual success and how they're doing that. Becomes really important. One other thought that's coming to mind is I was in a fascinating discussion the other day around performance management in general, and how do you measure how people are doing. Yeah. And we were talking about, it was with other people leaders, and we were talking about what people do and the impact they're having versus how they do it. And this is a classic conundrum when it comes to managing performance and measuring it. And there's the first example that will come to most people's mind is sort of like the really brilliant asshole, pardon the use of language, but like the brilliant jerk who is really great at their job, but sort of in how they're doing it is sort of pissing everybody else off or frustrating everyone or making them feel badly. And so then there's a trade-off of, what do we do with that? And I think on the flip side is, what if you have somebody who's incredible for your culture, is really great at making other people feel included and excited about what they're doing, but they're just not getting enough traction. And I think every company sort of faces examples like these, where you have to make a decision of what's acceptable and what's not. Mm-hmm. And by rewarding somebody who's not both having strong impact and doing it in a way that's in line with the culture, we're suddenly saying it's okay. It's okay to not have as much impact, or it's okay to not be doing it in a way that we think is brilliant. And so not having any performance management or ways to be able to say like, this is right or this is wrong, or we allow it, we don't allow it. Sometimes I work with leaders where sometimes they think by not saying it, it should be clear, like they're a jerk. Of course, we don't think that's great. But if you're not saying it, the assumption in the culture becomes, well, you can be a jerk and get away with it and get rewarded and continue to stay here and get promoted. And okay, if they can be a jerk, then maybe I'll be a jerk back, right? And so then suddenly you're seeing behavior in a culture that were totally unintended and should seem really obvious that we don't want them here. But if we're not doing anything around it, then suddenly they get, expanded or manifested in different ways through a company.
I'm always in the camp of over communicating versus, under communicating, and making sure, I think it's Brene Brown who says clear is kind, really having that clear expectation and framework for what it means to be part of the organization as well. I also kind of heard you say that curiosity piece is also really important in measuring effectiveness, and team members, whether they say it or not, are going to have some thoughts around how systems are working, how processes are working, individual feedback for their manager. I want to ask you how you see employee feedback management as a really important tool to building and continuing to cultivate a culture of listening and building that trust within an organization.
Yeah, so I think the impact of employee feedback management and listening is critical. We talked about how cultures are at their core a set of behaviors and words and actions of a group of people, and in terms of having a pulse on what's going on and being able to listen and build trust, we need to be able to have ways to collect that data and understand where what's happening and what's effective about it. So I do think it's really, really important to be collecting it on a regular basis. The one caveat I'll make when companies say, like, we want to do a survey, or we want to start doing these things, right? I am all for it if you can do something with that information.
Absolutely.
Right. So I think one of the hardest pieces is we might put out the survey. There's a lot of effort around putting out the survey, a lot of effort around slicing the data, putting out reports, putting it back in the hands of leadership to do something about it. And then employees see nothing, hear nothing about it. And then suddenly are like, wait, so I just, told you all this incredible input and I see no output. Mm-hmm. And if you do that enough times, because, things are busy, or maybe stuff is happening, but it's behind the scenes, and so employees don't see it more broadly, there's no communication back out, then employees stop putting in as high quality or as authentic or high trusted information into that system. And so I will tell companies, like, if you don't have bandwidth, or you don't have cycles, or you don't have leaders who are actually going to do anything with this, don't run the survey in the first place, because what you're doing is then eroding that trust, and it doesn't seem like you're listening, because you've taken it in and it's not even being acknowledged in a way that employees are hearing back.
Absolutely. That two-way communication is really important, and the odds of that individual giving feedback again are very low if they feel like they're not being heard, they're not being seen. In terms of kind of the different avenues for feedback as well, some folks are a little hesitant around kind of that anonymous feedback, and I want to ask why it's important to kind of offer that as an option for folks if they want to share something and not necessarily attach their kind of name to it yet, for whatever reason, even if it's the best company culture.
Yeah, so I've had the privilege of working in some incredible company cultures, and I think there was a priority around how do we create this highly trusted environment where people feel comfortable with direct feedback. And even in those environments, we would provide at least one anonymous feedback route. And part of it is because we're human beings. And, human beings, even when it's with somebody that we highly trust, there are going to be moments in time where actions, words, and behaviors are changing or being misinterpreted, or, we just haven't closed that communication gap. And so while for the most part, there's a lot of trust being built and a lot of direct feedback being given, there's just things that are easier to be said, or moments in time where it's more comfortable to be able to raise them in anonymous forums. And I think one of the things that AllVoices does really incredibly well is that it's creating both a safe space, but also one that's actionable, where you're going to feel heard and recognized for, hey, this is something that I want to bring up. And I think one of the things that's surprising and amazing about it is oftentimes I hear leaders being concerned about anonymous feedback, that people are going to misuse it, that they're going to just throw in a bunch of stuff that is them venting, or, it's almost like trolling on, public forums type of level of commentary that you might get. And I think what's been surprising with opportunities like AllVoices platform is that what you're seeing, and I think is wonderful, is that it's very high quality, because people realize it's one-on-one, it's with somebody who can do something about this problem. They're going to acknowledge it and hopefully be able to do something to change it. I will say I was in talking to another executive coach recently who's brilliant in his craft, and we were talking about feedback and what's really, really important about when feedback is being given, what's the response that's super important about it, right? Giving feedback's really hard, but actually the response that's given to it is actually what makes it feel like it was good feedback or like high quality feedback or not. And the first step of what he was saying was just acknowledging it.
Yeah.
Just saying, I heard it.
Mhm.
Is this what you said? Synthesizing it back and saying, is this what you said? Am I understanding it correctly? That's like 80% of what somebody's hoping to hear. And too often as human beings, I do this too. I'm trying to problem solve and figure out like, how do I actually fix the thing that you're bringing up to me right this moment? And I think sometimes that then, not sometimes, it does create this much higher bar, feeling like if someone's bringing me feedback, then I suddenly need to have to be able to do something about it. And even with the company survey, the engagement surveys that I mentioned, most of the challenges is not that we're not doing anything with it. The challenge is that we haven't acknowledged that we've received it and that we heard it, and here's what we heard, right? And that part is the big missing step. And so I do want to highlight that when we're thinking about feedback and how to respond to it, there's a huge opportunity in the way that we think about this cycle today, where this acknowledgement piece is a step that I think we could take more time in and more investment in, that would allow people to feel like I'm being listened to. And that helps to build that trust-based relationship to be able to have more, hopefully, direct feedback. But if not, then at least knowing here's a reliable feedback channel. At the end of the day, from a people and HR standpoint, what we want is for employees to be letting us know when there's things that could, that could be better, that there are opportunities for us to make this an environment that's going to be a more productive and impactful workplace. And so whether it's direct or anonymous, as long as it can be effective, I think we're really excited about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that acknowledgement piece, I also think +1 that is important. And it's a good demonstration of active listening and understanding, again, clarifying and being kind of clear about what you heard and making sure that you're hearing this person correctly as well. I have another question for you as well, whether it's in regard to onboarding, executive leadership, feedback. Even with the best of intentions, people are going to make mistakes, and that's okay. What are some of the common mistakes you're seeing leaders make when they're trying to kind of scale their organization?
Yeah, so there's a few that I see on a regular basis, and many of these tie back to sort of those executive specific qualities that we talked about earlier. So I think the first is around focus. Many leaders are focusing on what they default to what they're good at, as opposed to this broader scope and this thinking about things from a company standpoint. So I'll see leaders who will optimize for a metric that they're only their department's being measured on at the expense of something that maybe would be more impactful to the company. I think in terms of being strategic, there's a challenge. I was just talking to a people leader yesterday who was just saying, there's just all of the day-to-day firefighting that's happening. And while I get more energized thinking about the long term and these interesting problems, people and HR is at this turning point, right? Like we're changing the way that we're working, and how exciting is that? And you could see her eyes light up as she spoke about it. And I was like, how much time are you spending thinking about it? And she's like, I'm not, because I'm doing all this day-to-day firefighting. And that's a classic challenge that executives are facing, which is there's stuff right here that's on my to-do list and I can feel immediate impact around. But this investment in the longer term and the strategic, while it's exciting and interesting, it takes too much time to do. So that's one where I'll oftentimes actually say, well, like, take 10 minutes and brain dump. I'm sure you have ideas around how this future work thing's supposed to happen. Like, instead of making it feel like I need to take 2 days and do a retreat and like think about all these things in a really big way, take it down and like think about it in a much smaller chunk and see what progress we can make in that way as well. And then the last one I'll highlight that I think comes with scaling that's really challenging is around communications and decision making. So with every approximately doubling, organizations will feel it will suddenly feel like everything's slower, or like there's just so much back and forth that we're doing, and there's opportunities. And I see companies refactoring like the way that their Slack channels are named or how they're using their core communication channels, all hands meetings, agendas getting revamped, decision making matrices or tools getting introduced. And I think those are incredible opportunities to come and say like, hey, we're scaling quickly by introducing, maybe it's a new meeting format, we're suddenly increasing the productivity of everybody around. So I think being able to think proactively about those things can help smooth out those edges. And so I think it's one of the most exciting things in scaling. Like when you're encountering it, it's like, it's a good thing. Like we're big enough now, we need to actually go figure this out. But going through it can sometimes be really painful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's definitely something that I'm hearing and kind of the market is hearing as well with people leaders and HR executives and people in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really these kind of cultural leaders and champions as well. There's a lot to do, and you definitely want to focus on proactive strategies as well as reactive and just managing everything as well. Jess, is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to share with folks who are listening, or perhaps one to two kind of key takeaways around intentionality or being a great executive or giving feedback that you hope listeners bring with them after hearing our conversation here today?
Yeah, I guess maybe two things I'll highlight. I'm sure we could talk for hours. This is so
Yeah.
fun. Maybe two things. One is that having that pulse on the culture is key to creating a successful one. And I'll just reemphasize that whether it feels like it's in control or not, our culture is our words, actions, and behaviors. And so thinking about how to shift that and influence that and be intentional about it is can be really powerful.
Mhm.
The second thing I'll mention is this idea of starting small. Something is better than nothing, and I think sometimes we in the work that I'm doing with these fast growing companies, it's like, oh, we want to be able to train all our managers, and the vision is we're going to have this like really extensive, amazing, executive level program. And it's like, we can start much smaller than we can read an article about, leadership best practices and talk about that. And that takes a lot less effort and still has some bang for the buck. And I think sometimes, especially when companies are thinking about changing the culture or shifting the culture, making movements, we think big. And sometimes actually the most powerful thing is to start small, short, sweet, maybe a pilot, and see where it can go from there. And it's surprising how much momentum and traction can be built up in that way.
Absolutely. Testing out ideas, seeing if they kind of stay, getting feedback around them as well. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect, and you won't know if it's perfect unless you kind of test it out and lean it out as well. I think, if anything, this past 2+ years have taught us that business as usual is not cutting it, and we need to innovate and think differently and just have that time to think about what we want our culture to be like as well. Jess, thank you so much for taking the time to be on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, Christina. It was a pleasure being here.
Yes, and as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in that employee feedback management as a requirement for the organization to succeed overall. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.